So here we go with part 2 of taking apart or dissecting Scott Gordon's talk on Freemasonry as it relates to the LDS Temple Endowment, or so he says. So as I mentioned in the first one, we're going to be taking a look not only at the content of what he's saying his talk is about, but his technique in the arts of persuasion to get us to believe that things, there's nothing to worry about. Freemasonry, totally cool, man. You know, Joseph Smith's a holy prophet. He didn't get the temple endowment from a bunch of Luciferians. Heck no. You know, these are just highly moral, wonderful people, and Joseph Smith incorporated, you know, some aspects of what they had to symbolize things that would assist the Latter-day Saints in learning more about their loving Heavenly Father, as Thomas Monson likes to call him. Isn't that what Scott's going to weave into this? Using specific techniques in the arts of persuasion, which he apparently is well trained in. So we're going to continue about where we left off as far as his video presentation goes that he was doing in Italy. And might overlap by just a few seconds here, maybe half a minute or a minute. So here we go. Flip it. Okay, I guess I had it right in the first place. There we go.
So what they want to say is, don't tell anybody what happens so that they can have the experience for themselves. You can read many of the rituals yourself in Masonic libraries. This book was written in 1866. It's called Duncan's Ritual of Freemasonry. But again, Masons believe the lessons learned through the rituals are best understood when personally experienced. The Masons have instances in their ceremonies where they remind the initiates about the importance of secrecy. These have typically been described as what terrible thing you would rather have done to yourself than to share this secret. I remember as a child making a promise of secrecy. You know, I won't tell that secret. And then I would say, and this was very typical, good American children, we'd say, cross my heart and hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. You know, I'm not going to tell a secret. I don't know if they have similar things in Italian or not, but that's what we would say. Now, this gruesome child rhyme is very similar to the type of oaths within historic Masonry. Many opponents of Masonry, however, have claimed that these oaths are not oaths of secrecy, but oaths of vengeance and calls to violence. The second problem some people have with Freemasonry is its relationship with religion. There is no salvation in Freemasonry, and it is not a religion. They accept members of all faiths, they encourage members to go to church, but with an emphasis on morality and a belief in God. Some have argued that Masonry is a pseudo-religion, and since it does not include Christ, it is evil.
At the risk of slightly overlapping here, I'll just mention, as we did in the last video, a couple of things here. So Scott immediately starts comparing, you know, the oaths of the Freemasons to, you know, something little children would say. So naturally we're going to feel like, oh, well, you know, couldn't be that bad. It's what little children would say, okay? Even if it is a rather gruesome oath, you know, children stick a needle in my eye. That's pretty horrendous. Then it so is, you know, ripping out your tongue or slitting your throat, plucking out your heart, you know, all the sorts of things that were part of the penalties in Freemasonry that were also carried into the Temple Endowment in Mormonism, which were still there. At least we pantomimed them, you know, until about April of 1990. We were, you know, pretending we were slitting our throats and that sort of a thing, rather than reveal the Masonic secrets within the temple that we try to call sacred. There's nothing sacred about these bloodthirsty, sickening, demonic oaths at all. So, he said they'll take just about anybody in their religion as long as they have faith. But it's not faith in the Hebrew God by any stretch of the imagination. As we showed earlier, some 33rd degree Freemasons such as Anton LaVey, the founder of LaVeyan Satanism, who was, as I said earlier, a disciple through Ordo Templi Orientis in the Los Angeles area of Aleister Crowley, another 33rd degree Freemason. Another one of his disciples was L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. And we looked at various other Christian leaders such as Billy Graham, Robert Schuller, and I mentioned people like Oral Roberts, or, you know, there are so many others that are Freemasons and Luciferians, as we discussed in the previous video, leading Christianity because they don't believe the stuff that they teach the Christians. It's just somebody to take some money from and to manipulate, just like they do with their lower, their brethren from the lower levels in the Blue Lodge, the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, the master masons, just their goyim that they feed the lies to, basically, according to Albert Pike, who said, yeah, we don't tell them the real truth until they get up near the top. We just give them a bunch of garbage in their allegories. So these great learning experiences were nothing but BS sessions. And as long as they keep paying their dues and doing the free service, it's just like the church. They got their front organizations to look good for the public. Anyway, let's, if you missed that first video on this, you ought to be taking a peek at that. Back we go. First we did show Gord B. Hinckley and Thomas Monson doing their thing, exchanging Masonic grips. But I don't want to dwell on that at this point. I want to get back into it with Scott here and continue where we were.
Catholic Church has a particularly antagonistic relationship with Masonry. In the 18th century...
Well, they do have some history that's pretty rough. But then again, we saw in the photos there, saw the Pope greeting people with Freemasonic handshakes. So, it's kind of like looking at Bill Clinton and George Bush Sr. hating each other, or appearing to, in public when they're political opponents, but then later you see Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, and George Bush Sr., and George Bush Jr., and all these guys hanging out together and doing their world peace thing, as they call it.
There were condemnations by Pope Clement XII in 1738 and Pope Benedict XIV in 1751. In addition, there was a condemnation given by Cardinal Giuseppe Ferraio, Secretary of State for the Papal States, in 1739. These condemnations cite the secrecy with which the Masons surround themselves, the oaths they swear, and suspicion of acting against the peace and good order of society. It is fairly certain that the Pope also suspected them of heresy, due to their meetings where both Catholics and non-Catholics met together, which at the time was punishable by excommunication. It's not known for sure, but it's possible the first papal condemnation in 1738 came about partially because of the actions of Andrew Michael Ramsay. He was a knight who worked for the deposed King of England. He moved to France and tried to get people involved in Freemasonry. The French didn't seem interested in the group that focused around the work of stonecutters. I mean, can you imagine the French? You're trying to start a group and they say, what do we do? Well, we're stonecutters. Oh, I'm not a stonecutter. Well, we use these tools for stories.
I would say that it seems to me Scott is deliberately mischaracterizing these people. He didn't go there to, get people for the Stonecutters Union, okay? The symbology used is one thing, but to pretend that all these guys were a bunch of stonecutters and not involved in the occult is ridiculous. Scott knows he's a liar.
No, I'm not going to do that. So he made a famous speech which gave an entirely new history for Masonry. He put forward the claim that Masonry was not born of stonecutters in Scotland, which was what had been said before, but the origins came through the Crusaders in the Holy Land that made vows with the Knights of St. John to restore the temple to the Christians. And suddenly there was a great interest in Masonry. It was alleged at the time, and many believe today, that the Knights Templar, many of whom were imprisoned and excommunicated from the Catholic Church on Friday the 13th, 1307.
Excommunicated? They were excommunicated from life itself. In 1307, October 13th, on Friday the 13th, the raid on the Templar headquarters resulted in people being burned at the stake, Scott, and you know that. But for some reason, you don't want to talk about it, huh? So yeah, the Knights Templar and the Rosicrucians are said to have been vehicles through whom the mystery religion of ancient Egypt and ancient Babylon and perhaps Sumer were kept from those who might seek to expose them. The ancient mysticism contained within Rosicrucianism and the Templars is what we find in Freemasonry, no doubt, and in the Illuminati.
Found sanctuary with the Freemasons in Scotland. And it was further alleged that the Templars shared the secrets of the Temple Mount with the Masons. And this narrative creates the tie that the Masons have with the Templar Knights that we see in many of the books and movies today. Allegedly, the Masons also offered sanctuary to some of the early Protestant reformers, which certainly would not have made the Catholic Church very happy. In Italy, I think you recognize these names, maybe. In Italy in the late 1800s, there was a nationalist movement which sought to take the secular power from the Catholic Church. Two leaders of the nationalist movement, Camillo Benso, Count of Corvor, and Giuseppe Garibaldi, were both Freemasons. So the Pope put out a string of papal bulls condemning Masonry in the hope of weakening these two men and retaining the Catholic Church's secular power in Italy. In modern times, an Italian Masonic lodge named Propaganda Due was involved in several scandals. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing the Italian at least sort of close, probably not, but hopefully. Had its charter revoked in 1976. However, the lodge continued to operate, but as a group not affiliated with the legitimate Ground Lodge of Italy. Many high government officials belonged to this pseudo-Masonic lodge. During the years the lodge was headed by this man, Licio Gelli, members of this lodge were implicated in numerous crimes, including the collapse of the Vatican-affiliated Banco Ambrosiano, the murders of journalist Mino Pecorelli and bankers Roberto Calvi, and in corruption cases within the national bribe scandal Tangentopoli. So the Grand Oriente d'Italia, the Masonic Grand Lodge of Italy, took disciplinary action against the members of this lodge and erased the Propaganda Due lodge from its rolls. They were all excommunicated. They'd already been kicked out before they did this, but then after they did this, they erased their names as if they had never been members of the Masonic Lodge. And they did this because it violated the values of Freemasonry.
Oh, did it now, Scott? You know, that's the same type of cover-up we saw when Joseph Smith's confidant and close associate, John C. Bennett, got caught with his involvement with a number of the ladies in Joseph Smith's spiritual wife system in Nauvoo. And Joseph, Hiram, John Bennett, and others were involved with a lot of women in the spiritual wife system, and they weren't playing checkers and chess, Scott, and I think you know that. But when John got caught, he had to be excommunicated to save face for the brethren, because they couldn't have everyone knowing that, well, they practiced that sort of lasciviousness and basically were a bunch of swingers. You know, they had to keep the front alive that kept the parishioners paying their dues, their tithing, and giving their free labor to these pious men, who they paraded as being pious men on the front, but they turned out to be very lascivious Luciferians in their real lives. So John C. Bennett got caught, and he didn't appreciate the treatment that he got from Joseph Smith, apparently, the way things went down, so he started ratting him out. Anyway, he's been really maligned, of course, by the LDS propaganda machine as just a terrible, wicked man persecuting the righteous Joseph Smith, just like everyone did, persecuting the wonderful, righteous Joseph Smith.
But from these examples, we can see why there's a historic antagonism between Masons and Catholics, especially problematic here in Italy. Among Protestants, there's a mixed view on Masonry. The anti-Masonic rhetoric comes from the fundamentalist evangelical Christians who believe that Freemasons should be regarded as part of an evil organization devoted to the occult. Now, there's no evidence of this at all, but...
No evidence of it at all? Well, we saw what Albert Pike had to say about worshiping Lucifer, that Lucifer was their god, and that unfortunately Adonai, or in other words, the Lord, was also God, and that he was basically, a dark lord, and that Lucifer was the god of light and everything good. So no wonder Christians feel that way, since pretty much it's been said by multiple high-level Masonic lecturers and authors. But there's no evidence, of course, at all, right, Scott? No. Well, none that you're going to present anyway, along with your usual pack of lies.
Criticism started in the 1800s and was repeated to this day. In the German countries, there were problems with a non-Masonic group in Bavaria known as the Illuminati. Has anyone here heard of the Illuminati before? Yeah, it's in lots of books and movies. So in 1776, Adam Weishaupt, the dean of the law faculty at the University of Ingolstadt, established the Order of Illuminati and constructed a legendary history. Now, constructed a legendary history is a nice, polite way for saying he made it up. But it traced the origins of the organization back to Persia 1,000 years earlier. But unlike Masonry, which tries to remain non-political, Weishaupt planned to utilize his organization to overthrow the Kingdom of Bavaria and replace the monarchy with a form of republican government.
Interesting how once again you've lied and said Masonry tries to remain non-political. But when we look at the number of Freemasons in the population, and then we look at the extremely disproportionate amount of high-level Freemasons within prominent government positions, didn't you admit in the earlier portion of this? Maybe it's coming up still. What did you have, like 13 U.S. presidents as Freemasons that you could actually, prove? Really? So if you got, 30% or so of your U.S. presidents as Freemasons, but 1% of your population? What does that tell us? That tells us you just lied about they try not to be involved in politics, Scott. And trying to divorce the Illuminati from Freemasonry is, I need to come up with one of those, wonderful, some wonderful little example of that, like divorcing twins from each other or something. I mean, sorry, Scott.
So the crime of the Illuminati is that they were Republicans, or they wanted a Republican government. A year later, Weishaupt became a Freemason in Munich, and he began to recruit heavily among the Freemasons for followers. But then in 1784, the group was discovered and banned from Bavaria along with the Masons.
We're supposed to believe that Adam Weishaupt just came up with this whole thing. He wasn't funded by anybody. Is that what we're supposed to believe? Because I'm pretty sure we can find that some powerful families were backing him.
Aggressive police measures where they were either arrested or banned and expelled from the country dissolved and eliminated the Illuminati. But rumors persist that the Order of the Illuminati continues to this day, and Illuminati are favorite bad guys for many novelists and many movie writers. In modern
So we'll just put them in the urban legend category like you do with the Downites too, Scott, right? We won't attribute the French or American revolutions to Illuminists and Freemasons, will we? No. They're just, they're like a Harry Potter novel. Nothing to worry about, Scott.
In times, the Nazis under Adolf Hitler used an 1897 book titled The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This book taught that the Jews secretly controlled the Masons, and the two groups together were working toward world domination. Anti-Semitism became closely tied with anti-Masonry. The irony with this is that the Masons were mostly Christians. There were very, very few Jews among them at that time. The anti-Semitic and anti-Masonic Protocols of the Elders of Zion book was actually a forgery put together by the Russian secret police.
Oh my goodness, not the Russians, Scott. So, if we associate the authors of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion with the Russians, then that'll completely just discredit it, right, Scott? Is that what we're going to do here? It's all about associations, isn't it? And you said most of the Freemasons were Christians. But if they worship Lucifer as their leader stated, how can they be true Christians, Scott? Perhaps they just infiltrate and run Christianity, as we see people like Robert Schuller, Oral Roberts, Billy Graham, and many others. Or Joseph Smith, Charles Taze Russell, maybe Aleister Crowley. Well, no, excuse me, his disciples, L. Ron Hubbard.
Nevertheless, it became a central part of Nazi propaganda, and it's still read in many countries today, especially many of the Middle Eastern countries. When cities were captured by the Nazis, within 24 hours, the SS would burst into Masonic lodges, gather up all the books and the records, and send them to Berlin. The Nazis were hoping to learn the ancient mysteries of the temple, and they believed that the Masons were hiding that from the world. When the Russians then captured Berlin, they captured the Masonic libraries, and they shipped them off to Moscow, also hoping to find the temple secrets the Masons had been hiding from the world. Well,
hoping to find the secrets of the Masons? And you're saying the Russian leaders weren't Masons themselves? You're saying like Stalin wasn't a Mason? Who wasn't a Mason when we had these leaders meet after the World War? How about Stalin? How about Churchill? How about, how about Truman or FDR? Were these guys Freemasons, Scott? Were the representatives?
Libraries were not returned until the year 2000, and no great secrets or scandals were discovered in the books at all. Okay. They just found out who attended what meeting and who was behind in their dues, and not much.
Not much. Nothing to worry about. Just a boys' club. Starting to sound like Jedi Mormon now. Yeah, never mind. The Illuminati had nothing to do with planning the Russian Revolution. Nothing at all. Or the French Revolution, or the American Revolution, or instituting the Federal Reserve banking system. Nothing at all, Scott. Nothing at all. Or establishing Israel, even though we find that if we read the writings of Albert Pike, that stuff's part of the plan. That's why they had the Second World War. Scott, you know that. But I'm sure you're not going to say it. In fact, they got the League of Nations after the First World War. But after the Second World War, they wound up getting the United Nations, and then they wound up getting the State of Israel. And now we have Zionists making sure that Israel is funded through donations from the United States. That Mossad, a huge terrorist organization, the secret police, the CIA of the State of Israel, is funded basically from the United States in large part. A lot of people feel like Mossad is actually behind ISIS. And there's good reason for that.
So in America, Freemasonry was very popular for a time, but it fell out of favor in 1826 when a bricklayer named William Morgan threatened to expose the rituals of Freemasonry. He was going to publish a book, and Mr. Morgan suddenly disappeared and was presumed murdered. But his publisher went ahead and published the book anyway. There was a huge public outcry of people who were sure the Masons had killed Mr. Morgan, and maybe they did. We don't know. No one knows for sure. But it actually led to the creation of a political party whose sole purpose was to get rid of Masons. It was called the Anti-Masonic Party.
Yes, Scott. Captain Morgan Rum seems to be named after Captain William Morgan, as he was called. And there were confessions, deathbed confessions, as to the murder of William Morgan, which was done by Masons, because he broke the oath. He shared the secret handshakes like we've got in the temple, Scott. The signs, tokens, and penalties, even though, they took the penalties out in 1990. Gordon Hinckley waited 4 years after the Mother Lodge got rid of those for the Blue Lodge. Didn't want to look like he was following suit from his leaders now, did he? And so Captain Morgan's wife, well, she got remarried. She joined the church. Was it Kirtland or Nauvoo? And hooked up with Joseph Smith. I mean, according to her, she really hooked up with Joseph Smith. When Sarah Pratt went to unbosom her grief after Joseph Smith tried to talk her into bed when her husband was out on a mission Joseph called her on, Sister Harris said, "Gee, why trouble yourself? You gotta be nuts. I've been his mistress for like these last 3 or 4 years. Double check me. Might have been 3 years. She said 3 or 4. Probably was 3. Anyway, church tries to make it look legit and hint that they were sealed together. In fact, they might have been, I think they were shown as sealed together in Family Search. Spiritual wife system had nothing to do with sealing. Sealing was the way that Joe talked some women into bed that were hard to get. That's what Sarah Pratt said, the wife of Apostle Orson Pratt, who was virtuous enough to not cooperate with Unholy Joe when he said, "I hope you won't repulse me." But she did. Good job, Sarah.
And one of the main writers for that party, he wrote the newspaper for the party, was a man named W.W. Phelps. And he was the journalist for the anti-Masonic newspaper. And he later joined the church and became a scribe for Joseph Smith, and at one point became the assistant president of the church. The widow, there's W.W. Phelps. The widow of Mr. Morgan, Lucinda Morgan Harris, also joined the church. and some believe she was sealed to Joseph Smith, although the evidence of this is uncertain. This brings us to the connection with the story of the Mormons. The Saints had suffered much, the mobs of far west Missouri. They escaped back east across the river to Illinois, where they built the city of Nauvoo. Joseph Smith was looking for a way to protect the members of the church from their non-Mormon neighbors.
Oh, is that what it was? Well, Joseph Smith had already, created the Danite group, a secret combination. And through his Danite enforcers, he got rid of people who were problematic to the church. People that found out what he was doing and then started to spread the word. You keep hearing about how awful these apostates were back in the day. Well, we had half the apostles quit when Joseph Smith's fake bank and when his illegal banking operation with Sidney Rigdon failed, after he told everyone that God wanted them to invest in the bank and they couldn't go wrong doing it, that they'd be financially blessed and that sort of a thing. And then, of course, it was filled with fraud. They were charged with banking fraud. He and Rigdon fled. Half the apostles quit. Many members of the church decided they'd had enough of Joseph Smith, and some of them had gone ahead to Missouri, like W.W. Phelps, David Whitmer, Thomas Marsh, I think, some of those boys. And then Joseph Smith and Rigdon decided they wanted to take everybody's property there and said, everybody sign your stuff over to me, us. And some of these boys weren't having it at this point, so they said, you better get out of Caldwell County. You got about 3 days to do it, or we can't guarantee your safety. Sidney Rigdon gave the 4th of July extermination order speech, which wound up sending some of these people for assistance to the government in Missouri, and that's where we wind up having the governor finally issuing an extermination order to get rid of the Mormons who were threatening non-members and especially apostates in certain areas. So it's not just about persecution for the reasons that the church promotes. There are many members of the church who suffered because of Joseph Smith's wickedness and Sidney Rigdon's wickedness, but that doesn't mean that Joseph and Sidney were, just being persecuted for setting up the Lord's true church or something. Sidney was in business as a religious leader before he basically joined with Joseph Smith, brought his people over, before they merged. They had a merger, like a banking merger, They wound up changing the name of the church a little bit after that, from the Church of Christ that Joseph Smith founded to the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Then they decided to put, the name of Jesus or Christ or both back into the name and came up with their third name for the church later, 1838. Let's continue.
And he became interested in Freemasonry. As part of their ceremony, the Masons take an oath to protect and care for each other.
Within Masonry, as within the Danite group, yes, people are sworn to obey their superiors. And they needed that sort of allegiance to the leaders of the church, which is why they had those deadly oaths, and that they might identify a brother, and that they wouldn't want to rat on each other. But in some of the, shootouts that they had with the law-abiding, with the militias that represented, the state of Missouri, because they were trying to protect their own people from being driven out, apparently. Not that all their people were good, and not that they didn't do vigilante stuff against the LDS people either. Or I should say the Mormon people. It wasn't the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints until 1838. So there were the gun battles. There were the situations where people were killed. There were villages burned and looted by the Danites. And then they brought the stuff, the goods to the bishop's storehouse after pillaging villages that they were able to attack and destroy. So Apostle David W. Patton was killed in one of these battles with the militia that was defending the Missourians. So he didn't get to go on a mission, which Joseph Smith prophesied that he would. So that was one of those false prophecies we were talking about in the Letter to Apostle business the other day. Was that yesterday? All right, anyway, so Scott's mischaracterizing things as usual, trying to tell us that the church, is just persecuted by the devil or something. It had nothing to do with the fact that Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and the boys were running a criminal operation similar to a mafia ring.
It seemed the perfect solution. The saints would all become Freemasons. And they would fall under the same protection of their Masonic non-Mormon neighbors. And at the same time, maybe they could learn these ancient rituals of Masonry, which were at the time believed to be from the Temple of Solomon.
Why would you need to join a Luciferian group to learn ancient mysteries if you've got a prophet who's a prophet and a seer and a revelator who can have God come and appear to him almost on demand, or an angel or Jesus, who can look into his magic rock and have all sorts of revelations? As we read in the Book of Mormon, I believe it's in Alma or Mosiah, where it talks about a seer stone there, essentially. It says that Mosiah possessed this stone that would shine forth in darkness and bring to light the wickedness of their brethren and all that sort of a thing, that he could receive his revelations through it. Okay? Not to mention the magic glasses we find in Ether chapter 3, which, we were supposed to believe Joseph Smith was using to translate the Book of Mormon until they, too many people started talking about the Seer stone, and they wound up publishing that and saying, okay, yeah, sure. We're telling you this all the time. You just must not have been listening in Sunday school. That's one of the things I think Flackerman caught Scott Gordon lying about in his video called Tactics of a Mormon Apologist, where he just roasts Scott lie after lie when Scott's trying to say that the people sharing true church history were misrepresenting it. But then what we find in Flackerman's video, by watching Scott and then having him document the facts, is that Scott's a liar. Okay, let's keep it going here.
The Apostle John Woodsoe later wrote that Joseph Smith was initiated into the Masons to foster the spirit of brotherhood and to lessen the mob persecutions to which the church had been subjected in Ohio and Missouri. Ultimately, Joseph's attempt to win sufficient friends through Masonry to stop persecution failed, obviously. It is alleged that Joseph gave the Masonic cry of distress during his martyrdom, and yet his non-Mormon Masonic brothers did nothing to help. And it's likely many of those non-Mormon Masonic brothers were in the mobs that killed Joseph Smith. And this made Brigham Young very angry, and he later said that those Illinois Masons, he said of those Illinois Masons that Joseph and Hiram were put to death by the Masons. And we know.
And why would they want to do that? Was Joseph soliciting their women and their wives and their daughters? Or was it strictly because he was sharing the Masonic signs, tokens, and penalties in the endowment? Now, he originally started, at least we know, basically initiating other members of the church into Freemasonry before they would receive the LDS endowments, the way I believe I've heard it, so that he wouldn't be sharing these things with non-Masons. But how does that work with the women?
He was only referring to those Illinois Masons because Brigham Young retained his Masonic membership even as he went to Utah, but he was very angry at the Masons at that time. So at this point, many LDS members question how Joseph Smith and the Nauvoo Mormons could join Masonry when the Book of Mormon clearly states that secret combinations are of the devil. Masons keep their ceremonies secret. So therefore, they are a secret combination.
So now Scott's going to redefine secret combination for us and make it all okay. Hey, let's not forget, Scott, that In the book of James, and maybe it's also in Matthew, we are told, do not forswear yourselves, but let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, and anything more or less than this cometh of evil. But forswearing yourself is exactly what you do in Freemasonry, and it's exactly what you do in the Temple Endowment. Nevertheless, Scott will craft this to make it sound just like it's, a misunderstanding. That's all.
Nation, isn't that right? Even Martin Harris, who was an anti-Mason himself, he belonged to the anti-Masonic party too. He took out an advertisement in the local newspaper for the Book of Mormon, and he called it the new anti-Masonic Bible. So one of our Sunday school guys, forgive me, this is in English, but I'll read it. The Guide to the Scriptures defines secret combinations as an organization of people bound together by oaths to carry out the evil purposes of the group. In 2 Nephi 9:9, speaking of the devil, it says, "He stirreth up the children of men unto secret combinations of murder and all manner of secret works of darkness." In conference, Elder Melvin J. Ballard said, "The Book of Mormon teaches that secret combinations engaged in crime present a serious challenge, not just to individuals and families."
We know that the Danites carried out a great deal of crime, and if you read carefully what Joseph Jackson's sworn testimony has to say, and if you read about what John Doyle Lee has to say, who was a very prominent Danite, and also he was sealed to Brigham Young, you will find many corroborating things that teach us that Joseph Smith indeed ran a crime organization, especially in Nauvoo. Well, the Kirtland fake bank was definitely, high-level bank fraud, corruption, all the sorts of things that they were involved with. It's nothing like we hear in the correlated lessons. But if you look at the primary source material, you will see that Joseph Smith is nothing like he thought he was. Are these people? How did he have no discernment then to wind up with these confidants that, turn out to be so corrupt? John C. Bennett, of course, he's also thought to have been involved in doing a lot of abortions, covering up for Joseph Smith's philandry. Did he train the Nauvoo Legion or have something to do with getting, the city charter for Joseph Smith there? Which really was a boost for Joseph Smith, because every time they tried to arrest him, he'd just, get a writ of habeas corpus right through Nauvoo and eliminate the ability of other jurisdictions to take him down. He operated like a king. In fact, he was anointed as the king by the Council of 50, another secret combination which he formed. So their counterfeiting operation that they had, the bank fraud that they had, the spiritual wife system, which is massive amounts of fornication and adultery. These women were like, sexual timeshares for Joseph and his inner circle. The list just goes on and on. Yes, they operated secret combinations for sure. So the endowment was calculated to bring other people, to bring everyone basically underneath some form of greater binding authority. And of course, if we believe that our families are sealed together through virtue of the holy priesthood, then we have to obey our leaders, or else those promises disappear. Not to mention the fact that they'll, tell your wife just to dump you and marry somebody else if you no longer believe that the brethren are led by the God of Israel. Because then you're worthless in getting her to the celestial kingdom. So she needs to be sealed to somebody else. So they'll happily destroy your earthly family as quickly as possible. Not to mention, if you actually believe this stuff, then you're going to do whatever they say. Pay your tithing, go on a 3-year mission, while Joseph's, shacking up with your wife. Do anything that we say, or else you lose everything that you want for eternity. It's very binding. And if you want to tell what we're doing, well then, we've got people that are sworn to murder you. The endowment's changed quite a bit from what it was earlier. The oath of vengeance, the Masonic oaths involved taking life for those who violated its secrecy, which Joseph Smith did, and he paid the price.
Families, but to entire civilizations. Among today's secret combinations are gangs, drug cartels, and organized crime families. The secret combinations of our day function much like the gatien robbers of Book of Mormon times. They have secret signs and code words. They participate in secret rites and initiation ceremonies. And among their purposes are to murder, plunder, and...
Oh, are they now? Why does that sound familiar? Secret signs, murder, plunder, bomb nations, take their resources, their oil, their... Oh my, here's a secret handshake. Political leaders with religious leaders who stand on the towers like Amalekites and tell us it's our patriotic duty to support these guys when they want to go to war, when they want to bomb Iraq, murder thousands and thousands of innocent people. Yeah, it's these guys that tell us to do it. Because it's the will of God, of course. Isn't it? We're just doing our duty. Defending our families. Why did Gordon Hinckley and Dick Cheney make these funny handshakes with each other? And Thomas Monson and George Bush? Are they all Freemasons? Oh, they're not in a secret combination. George Bush isn't in the Skull and Bones. Silly conspiracy theorists. You're all paranoid. The only thing we have to worry about is the Mafia and MS-13, right?
Steal and commit whoredoms and all manner of wickedness contrary to the laws of their country and also the laws of God. So if we compare these prophetic warnings with the Freemasons, they don't really fit the definition of a secret combination. Freemasons as a group do not plan murders.
They fit like a glove, Scott, but the peons at the bottom who pay their dues and make the organization look good fit closer to the definition that you're trying to give because they obfuscate what the people at the top do.
They plan how to fund hospitals.
Oh, yeah.
They do not plan to overthrow the government. That would be groups like the Illuminati, who are not Masons. At least.
Sorry, Scott. The Illuminati, who are not Masons. Oh, God. That's a good one.
Not a recognized Masonic group. Freemasons don't plunder, steal, and commit whoredoms. In fact, they teach against those things, and they expel members who engage in those activities.
Is George H.W. Bush a Freemason? Looks like his boy sure knows the handshakes. And what about all the human trafficking these people are involved in, the Bush family and the Clinton cartel? I mean, they do their best to cover things up, but there have been investigations even in the White House multiple times. George H.W. Bush, there we know there were sex slaves.
So on December 29th, 1841, the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge was organized. On March 15th, 1842, Joseph Smith was initiated as an apprentice. And then later that month, he was raised to the level of Master Mason. On May 4th of that same year, Joseph introduced the new endowment to 9 men on the second floor of his red brick store. He had the second floor prepared for the event. Now remember, this is before the Nauvoo Temple was built. There were no temples at that time, or the Nauvoo Temple was not there for that time. He had the second floor prepared by hanging canvas tarps and partitioning off the second floor into 5 rooms, representing the creation, the Garden of Eden, the earth after Adam and Eve's expulsion, in the present-day world, and the celestial room. And 9 of Joseph's closest followers were given their endowments there. At the conclusion of the endowment, Joseph told Brigham Young, "It's not arranged right, but we've done the best we could under the circumstances in which we are placed. I wish you," talking to Brigham, "to take this matter in hand and organize and systematize all of these ceremonies with the signs, tokens, penalties, and keywords." Brigham commented, "I did so, and each time I got something more. So that when we went through the temple at Nauvoo, I understood and knew how to place them there. We had our ceremonies pretty correct. Pretty correct."
Does the God of Israel reveal things that are pretty correct?
So, if Joseph Smith created the temple ceremonies after he was a Mason, did he just copy Freemasonry to create the temple ceremony? To discuss that, let's talk about first what goes on inside of the LDS Temple, to the extent is appropriate in this setting. And just so you know, I checked, so we're okay. We're okay.
Let's see what we can check here, Scott. Let's check on you. I feel like checking on Scott. Oh. Is that in images here? We can do better than that. Let's look at some images. Oh, Scott, who are these Freemasons around you? I see Anton LaVey, Satanist. I want to see that all-seeing eye business and all that stuff I look like the Pope is interested in. Oh, my. There's a book, Mormons and Masons. Oh, don't we have a few interesting pictures here I wanted to look at? Scott. I'm going to have to pause it. We've heard a little too much talking now. We just need to have a little bit of... Isn't Joseph a humble-looking guy there? A little bit of... Wait a minute. Is that you, Scott? Maybe that's Jedi Mormon in his early days. Is he astride a tapir in some temple clothing with a Jedi lightsaber next to a hippotato? Well, is this stuff we can talk about? Where is this guy? Temple Square. Goodness gracious, how did he pull that off? His baker's hat. Okay. I just thought we should take a break. Oh, did I mention we hit 300,000 minutes? On December 7th, actually. Even though it said December 5th on it. Alright. Back to business here.
The first and most familiar ordinance in the temple is baptism for the dead. Baptisms are performed in a font that rests in the back of 12 oxen. The font is modeled after the basin described in Solomon's temple in 2 Chronicles 4:4, where it talks about standing on 12 oxen with 3 facing each direction. Now,
So Scott's tying Mormonism into the Bible because he wants to give a Christian appearance of the temple.
Just so you know, a lot of people will say these oxen represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and I hear that in the temple all the time I go.
Yeah, because we were told that by our church leaders, Scott, so I suppose we're supposed to think that, aren't we?
And they do, kind of. I mean, when I was growing up, I thought, oxen, yes, they pulled ox carts taking the pioneers across the plains. Of course they're oxen. But no, it comes from the Bible, and the Bible describes the oxen. And the ox is the symbol of the tribe of Joseph, Ephraim. And so symbolically, we have Joseph, or Ephraim, going out to the 12 tribes of Israel to bring them back in for salvation. So that would be my interpretation of the ox.
Yeah, my interpretation is that Ephraim and Manasseh were supposedly sons of Joseph. And Joseph was sold into Egypt, and he married the daughter of the high priest of the sun god. And what we learn in Abraham chapter 1 is that all of the Egyptians sprang from that race that could not have the priesthood because they were cursed. So how is it that the descendants of Joseph through Ephraim and Manasseh would have the priesthood, if right there in the book of Abraham we are told that the Egyptians were cursed, that they could not hold the priesthood because they had the blood of the Canaanites, which was preserved in the land through Egyptus, who managed to get on the ark? Well, Scott, they never talk about that in Sunday school, do they? So, where do we get this authority for the temple? Then again, when did priesthood ever have to do with anything other than killing animals?
You can interpret it differently if you'd like, but that's how I feel. And that I get that interpretation from Matt Brown and his book, Symbols in Stone.
Why are we talking about your interpretations or Matt Brown and his books? Don't we have anything authoritative from the leadership of the church? Don't we have apostles and the prophets that are supposed to authoritatively tell us what the oxen are symbolizing and what the baptismal font is for and all of these sorts of things? Why is it we're looking to Fairmormon to learn interpretations of what the Temple Endowment is supposed to be, or anything else in Mormonism? Why aren't we getting apostles and prophets who are prophets, seers, and revelators, they say, other than actually being boards of directors of, a large corporate empire and pretending to be apostles and prophets? Why is it that they are not giving us definitive answers? Why do we have anonymous gospel topics, essays writers on LDS.org, and why do we have serious questions being, either ignored by the brethren or partially or addressed in some apologetic manner by guys like you with no official stance or authority from the church? Is it all about plausible deniability so that the church doesn't have to say, oh yeah, that came from us and I guess we're burned online again? Like saying that, the book of Abraham was written by the hand of Abraham and Joseph Smith translated it, and then it comes out having zero to do with Abraham and wasn't even written anywhere near the time he was supposed to have lived?
So, we do baptism. The second ceremony in the temple is the washing and anointing ceremony, where one is symbolically washed and anointed. This is recorded in the book of Exodus, chapter 40, verses 12 and 13, where it says, "And thou shalt bring Aaron and his sons unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and wash them with water."
Oh, but I thought that's called the Old Testament because the New Testament kind of got rid of the need to go through all these Old Testament, performances and that sort of a thing, Scott. So how is it that Joseph Smith brought the Old Testament back into play after the New Covenant, the New Testament, eliminated the need for these things? Did it only eliminate the need for chopping up animals, slitting their throats and burning them? Is that all it did? Is it selectively wiping out some of the Old Testament performances, Scott?
And thou shalt put upon Aaron the holy garments, and anoint him, and sanctify him, that he may minister unto me in the priest office. The third thing that happens in the temple is the Endowment Ceremony, where through film or personal dramatization, one symbolically falls from the presence of God, makes covenants to follow God in Jesus Christ, and eventually returns back to the presence of God. Fourth, there is the sealing or marriage ceremony.
And so we're taught a bunch of secret handshakes that we're supposed to be able to show to the angels who stand as sentinels between us and the celestial kingdom. And if we know the handshakes, then if we've been good boys and girls, we can get into the celestial kingdom. But if we don't know the secret handshakes, we're screwed. We've got to know the Masonic secret handshakes to get into heaven. That's basically what we're taught there. You've got to be able to give the tokens and signs to the Lord through the veil. Just like they do in Freemasonry. Knock, knock, knock.
Couples are sealed to each other, and where parents and children are sealed to one another as families for time and all eternity. So how does this compare with Freemasonry? In Freemasonry, there is no baptism. In Freemasonry, there is no confirmation. In Freemasonry, there is no washing and anointing, except for one very obscure rite, one very small group. In Freemasonry, there is no sealing. In Freemasonry, there is no concept of work for the dead.
Okay, well, so what, Scott? What does that have to do with anything? The fact that Joseph Smith took elements from the Freemasonic ritual and said that you've got to learn these secret handshakes to get into heaven, and if you share them with anybody, then you can have your throat slit or your heart ripped out or all these gruesome things. Just because they didn't adopt everything within Freemasonry into the endowment, or just because the endowment has elements of other things in it that Joseph Smith put in his mishmash, doesn't mean he didn't copy stuff out of Freemasonry. Doesn't mean he didn't copy stuff out of Genesis. It doesn't mean he didn't copy some of the Luciferian teachings that we find in high-degree Freemasonry and mishmash all this stuff together. Maybe adding some Swedenborgian stuff into it as well. The fact that they don't have all of the same elements and that he took some from here and some from there doesn't negate the fact that he was just copying stuff out of various other disciplines, Scott. Once again, you're trying to deceive us. Oh, and sealings? Well, wait a minute. Where do we find sealings? Oh, that's right. Satanism. That's the religion that's all into sealing. Mormonism and Satanism. Strange bedfellows. The more you learn, the more you know that it's maybe not so strange after all.
In Freemasonry, there is no salvation through Jesus Christ. Most of what goes on in the temple has no...
You're right. There is no salvation through Jesus Christ in Freemasonry. That's for sure. We heard what the leaders said about Jesus Christ or his, his equivalent, Adonai, the god of darkness and evil. So, why is Joseph Smith getting stuff for what's supposed to be preparing people, endowing them with power to return to God in Mormon theology, from an organization who basically, at their highest levels, decry God, the God of Mormonism, or the God of Christianity, as the evil God? They praise Lucifer, but within the temple, we find Lucifer equals Satan in Mormonism. He's the bad guy. So we've switched. We pulled the switch there. Lucifer's the good guy in Freemasonry, but he's the bad guy in the LDS Temple, yet we get all sorts of elements, Luciferian teachings, and the rituals, including the blood oaths from Freemasonry, and put them into the temple. A strange way to get revelation, I'll say. Very, very contradictory. And it's Lucifer that teaches us to be modest in the temple, saying to bust out the fig leaves. It's Lucifer that teaches Eve that there must be opposition in all things, that we must know the bitter to prize the sweet.
Resemblance at all to anything Masonic. There are, however, a few small similarities that I'll go over. Now, many of the early...
So, Scott makes it look like, there's really very little resemblance between Masonry and Mormonism, but just to make sure he's being completely honest and giving full disclosure, he's going to give us this minutia, just to add to the air that he's actually, revealing it to you, debunking it, and when you're done with this, you can sit down and say, you know what? I can't believe all those people just exaggerating this completely out of proportion, and, there's just nothing to worry about. It's totally normal to have stuff from a Luciferian religion in your holiest place of worship. Oh, of course, he didn't mention that it was Luciferian, now did he? No, Scott's been completely dishonest about so many things, and he's mischaracterized things, and so he's painted good to be evil and evil to be good. He's put light for darkness and darkness for light. He's fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah himself.
Saints who went through the Nauvoo Temple were already Freemasons. Remember, Joseph Smith wanted everyone to become a Freemason so they could be protected by their non-Mormon Masonic neighbors.
Oh, is that why,
and Freemasons included people like Brigham Young, Willard Richards, William Marks, Hiram Smith, and Heber C. Kimball. They believed that Freemasonry was an apostate form of temple worship from Solomon's temple. So just as they had no problem with Joseph...
And you pretty much said that was a bunch of BS earlier, Scott. You said that it didn't come from Solomon's temple. So if Joseph Smith thought so, and he's the prophet, that doesn't make him a very good prophet now, does it? I guess God can enlighten him that the sisters can't drink tea if Emma's pissed about them, spitting tobacco in the High Council room, but he can't let them know that their Luciferian religious rites from Freemasonry aren't from Solomon's temple. Or are they? And maybe you've just got everything backwards. And again, Solomon was a sorcerer, which is why we have the hexagram. For hexing people. It had nothing to do with David, but we call it the Star of David, don't we? Maybe you don't know your witchcraft well enough. Or then again, maybe you do, and you're just careful not to disclose those things that will tarnish the image of the LDS Church or Freemasonry.
If receiving revelation on apostate practices of Christianity, they had no problem with Joseph receiving revelation on how the temple ceremony should be carried out. They didn't seem to believe the temple ceremony was simply borrowed from the Masonic ceremony. They didn't believe that.
Then why did Heber C. Kimball say that it was celestial masonry when they practiced it in the endowment, slightly altered?
W. Phelps and Lucinda Morgan Harris. Remember them from earlier? Both very strong anti-Masons. And Lucinda had her husband killed over Masonry. They were endowed in the Nauvoo Temple, and they had no problems with it. And they did not believe the temple.
And she had no problem having sex with Joseph Smith when she was married to Mr. Harris either. So that doesn't say a whole lot about the scruples of Lucinda Harris to me.
Temple endowment was Masonry. After the temple ceremonies were performed in Nauvoo, the Masonic Lodge continued to operate. The other church members, who were also Masons, did not feel the temple replaced Masonry. They didn't believe it was the same. Even anti-Mormon writer Fanny Stenhouse wrote, "It's always been commonly reported, and to a great extent believed, that the mysteries of the endowment house were only a sort of initiation of the rites of Masonry."
Well, once again, you mischaracterize things. It's not that it's only Freemasonry. It's that Joseph Smith brought elements of a Luciferian religion into what was supposed to be a house dedicated to the God of Israel, who's supposed to be the arch enemy of Lucifer. And so that's a problem, Scott. And it's a problem that he can't seem to get his revelation on how to do this endowment without going to a Luciferian organization, instead of having angels come down and tell him all about it like they seem to do with everything else.
But I need hardly say that this statement, when examined by the light of facts, is altogether ungrounded and absurd. So if the Mormons and the anti-Mormons both believe the temple, who are familiar with both ceremonies, this is a group that knew the Mason ceremony and knew the temple ceremony, and they didn't believe there was a connection, that the temple was Masonic, why does the question of connection still exist today?
Actually, the whole concept of a temple comes from Freemasonry. As we learn that Joseph and Brigham went to Masonic temple dedications even before doing the temples, for the LDS Church, which were basically fashioned after being Masonic in many ways, not just in their teachings. Dedicating a temple is something from Masonry. If we look into Royal Arch Masonry, we will find so much language that we are familiar with within the LDS Church. High Councils, or the Grand Council of Heaven, the Order of Melchizedek. Thing after thing that we are familiar with, we will find as we read through the articles of Royal Arch Freemasonry. The more you become familiar with Masonry and magic, the more you see things from the LDS Church that you thought came from God.
It exists because there are a few similarities between the Masonic rituals and a few of the phrases and actions used in the endowment ceremony. Additionally, there are a few Masonic-like symbols on the outside of the Salt Lake Temple. So let's talk about the similarities. And we'll first talk about the symbols on the Salt Lake Temple.
And then we'll just make sure that we downplay things and normalize them and not find them rooted in the occult.
Before the Salt Lake Temple was built, Brigham Young sent architects all over Europe to look at the many great cathedrals. We have beautiful cathedrals here.
Oh, Brigham Young sent the architects to go check out the edifices of the Church of the Devil. Brigham Young was replete in his renunciation of the great and abominable Church of the Devil, the great and abominable Catholic Church, whom he said was the mother of harlots, the whore of Babylon, and the Protestants were just the offspring of this whore. So he's going to send his architects to learn about the whore of Babylon and the edifices built to Satan, so that they know how to make a proper temple for his God. That makes all kinds of sense, Scott.
Don't we? We have domos, we have lots of beautiful things. And the architects looked at those first before they built the Salt Lake Temple. I was just talking to one of the YSA members yesterday, and she was commenting on all the many symbols on the Catholic Church in her town that were like Masonic symbols. But it's likely that they got many of the ideas to design these symbols from here in Europe. And Matthew Brown goes further in his book, Symbols in Stone, and he comments that Joseph Smith talked about many of these symbols even before he was involved in Masonry.
Well, Joseph Smith was involved in the occult before he officially became a Freemason. Let's not forget that his brother Hiram was a Mason, that his dad was a Mason, that Sidney Rigdon conveniently lived near some Rosicrucian monks who may have contributed something to the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith was surrounded by Masons. Obviously, Brigham was a Mason, and Heber Kimball. So we've got all sorts of Masonry surrounding Joseph Smith, some of which is shareable and some of which is, held under their sacred covenants or their oaths of secrecy. It depends the language that you want to use. When it's in the church, we call it sacred covenants. When it's in Masonry, we call it, oaths of secrecy. But it's the same thing, isn't it, Scott? Slitting your throat from ear to ear, as Brigham used to encourage people to do, to people who had left the church since they couldn't be saved, and their own blood must atone for their sins, lest they spend eternity in outer darkness, comes from Freemasonry.
So many of these symbols have deep roots in Western Christian culture.
Because Western Christian culture and Freemasonry have deep roots in mysticism from the Egyptian mystery schools and the Babylonian mystery religions. That's why, Scott, they have common roots deep in the past. We know that the Roman Empire destroyed the library at Alexandria, don't we? Destroying evidence of civilizations that predated anything that they wanted to teach as part of the history according to the new religion that they invented called Christianity after they invented this fellow called Jesus from Nazareth. You trying to normalize things doesn't change the fact that mysticism, Christianity, magic, and Masonry all have common roots deep in the past, as Albert Pike teaches us very clearly as we read his works. But you don't bother to share these things, do you? I wonder what's in the secret teachings of all ages from Manly Hall. I've listened to some of his talks. They're pretty interesting. He knows what he's talking about. It seems like no matter how many of these guys that lecture for Freemasonry that I listen to, they're always experts in the occult. Why is that, Scott? I thought you said they were Christians. Oh, that's right. The Christians' leaders are Freemasons. They just don't believe the crap they teach those people who pay. It's kind of like interest. Gordon B. Hinckley said, those who don't understand interest pay it, those who do collect it. Same way with tithing and membership dues.
And we can find things like handshakes, stars, pentagrams, the all-seeing eye. There's one large anti-Mormon website, and it claims the phrase, holiness to the Lord, which we find on all the temples, has been copied from the Masons, because the Masons also have that phrase in some of the...
We also find that the magical parchment that Hiram Smith carried and was carrying when he was shot was called Holiness to the Lord, and it was a magic parchment. Joseph Smith was carrying his magical Jupiter talisman that's supposed to give you power to gain wealth and power over women. They were in the occult long before Joseph Smith ever became a Freemason, Scott, and you know it. Holiness to the Lord is magic.
Their buildings. But that phrase occurs several times in the Bible, always in connection